Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore why darkness and the dark side of life have a special kind of attraction for a lot of us. And here's the usual roadmap and the material in this video. You can also find the same roadmap in the description section of this video along with links to the timestamps. Anyhow, probably the easiest and most obvious way of thinking about the allure of darkness would be in terms of how we often look for excuses to do what we really want to do anyhow, but which social prohibitions would normally prevent. And, okay, at a certain level of description, there's probably some truth to that. But as you could see from the roadmap, in this video I'd like to explore the allure of darkness in ways that are a little less obvious and hopefully a little bit more surprising than that. Anyhow, as usual, the first challenge is to get a handle on what darkness even is. I suppose that in the history of the West, the main way of thinking about darkness has been in terms of Christian theology, and especially the idea of sin, evil, and rebellion against God, as personified by Satan, for instance, the Prince of Darkness himself. However, a somewhat more modern and also more secular view comes to us by way of psychology, which would cast darkness in terms of our negative, destructive desires and behavior, as well as the seething dynamisms of the unconscious. That is, the hidden part of ourselves that we actively repress so we don't have to become consciously aware of it. As in the case of the Freudian Thanatos drive, for instance, or the Jungian shadow. However, the element that's common to both the Christian account of darkness as well as its psychological counterpart is the idea that we ourselves are dark, even in the deepest recesses of our human nature. And so the first part of why darkness is attractive to us is because of that. In essence, we're drawn to it because it's part of what we are. Of course, at the same time, we're also bearers of light, which in this case would have to do with the positive, constructive side of our nature. But that's not what makes darkness so strangely appealing. It's because the darkness that attracts us is a reflection of the darkness that resides within us, and our contact with it consequently affirms the wider horizon of our human nature. And so, when we feel the sickly, sweet, seductive pull of shadows in our lives, in a way, it feels like we're coming home, like we're returning to our origin and laying claim to the fuller arc of what we've been all along. But at this point, maybe you're thinking something like, well, that can't apply to me. I'm a good person who does lots of good stuff in the world. And yeah, maybe you are. But consider what it takes, even at a crude biological level, to continue your existence. Basically, we all have to eat. And what that means is that something has to die for you to keep on living. Sure, you can try to blunt the impact of that harsh reality by becoming a vegetarian or maybe even a vegan, both of which I've done personally. But that just shifts the death scenario from one domain to another, from the world of animals to that of plants. But the one inevitable constant remains. Basically, you're a killer, and so am I. But now maybe you're thinking, "Defa, bruh, I'm not a killer. I just go to the supermarket and buy what's there." Yeah? So basically, you're paying for someone else to do the killing for you. And when you think about it, it's a little bit like hiring a hitman rather than committing murder yourself, isn't it? But of course, what that means is you're still a killer. Just a killer by proxy. And the unpleasant fact is that among your other charms and doubtlessly sterling qualities, you've always been a killer and a bringer of ruin and annihilation with every breath you take. Because every single breath and every single heartbeat, even the ones happening in this exact moment right now, are secretly resting upon the innumerable graves of everything that has had to die for you over the years. And God, I really hate to be the one to break it to you, but you and I, we're all hidden executioners, each of us burning like a living funeral pyre in the night of this world, and our very existence is an ongoing death knell, tolling mournfully through the veiled mists of time. Damn, don't you just love watching my videos? So uplifting and inspirational, aren't they? Anyhow, so what's the point of that little homily? Well, the first point is to help you realize something about what you and I are, and how a kind of darkness runs to the very center of it, even if we don't like to think of ourselves that way. Perhaps especially if we don't like to think of ourselves that way. In other words, the point is to demonstrate that darkness isn't just something that happens every now and then. In fact, one of the more unsettling realities of human existence is that our forbidden bestial desires are always living and breathing inside of us, like a caged panther pacing continuously back and forth behind the cold iron bars of what we're willing to admit about ourselves. And we're attracted to darkness partly because the predator within us is always ravenous and always trying to find ways to gratify itself in ways that lie far beyond the refinement and politesse of socially appropriate behavior. But, of course, what we normally do when we start to perceive the ravening beast within ourselves is to drive it back into the deep inner recesses of our unconscious, far beneath the radar screen of our conscious awareness, because the fact is that it can be a very daunting thing to glimpse and admit, most of all to ourselves. That's because most of us are a lot more comfortable dwelling in the bright, positive side of what we are, the constructive, life-affirming side that feels a lot less disturbing and a lot less threatening. And like I said a minute ago, all of that is definitely part of the human equation too. But personally, I think it's also important for us to come to grips with the darker, more challenging side of what we are, at least now and then. That's first because of what we've already noted, that there's a value inherent to laying claim to the full run of our humanity, which is to say, a value to our being in contact with reality. However, perhaps surprisingly, another reason has to do with wisdom. And one of the unnerving things about wisdom is that it's born mostly in our shadows, in the elusive, fugitive parts of ourselves, the parts that are hard for us to perceive and comprehend. That's because the muses of our greater wisdom don't usually visit us when we're lounging easily in the warmth of our comfort zones. Instead, they come to us much more often like wraiths in the dark night of our souls, like phantoms whispering in the unsettling penumbra of what we find difficult or even impossible to endure. But why is that? Well, first it's because it takes a certain amount of tension in our lives to spur us in the direction of wisdom. And when you think about it, without tension, without pain and darkness, what motivation would we ever have to traverse wisdom's rocky, tortuous byways? Probably not much. And because of that, wisdom doesn't arise primarily from the parts of ourselves that are easy to acknowledge and affirm. Instead, wisdom is born mostly in the daunting challenge of recognizing the totality of our being, both our strengths and our weaknesses, our great talents as well as our wretched failings, both our luminous brilliance and the pall of our shadows and sorrows. Basically, wisdom is forged in the crucible of our suffering, with a necessary admixture of joy and ecstasy to be sure, but that's not what makes it a challenge for us. What makes wisdom a challenge is that contact with darkness of one sort or another is the price it exacts from us. And by the way, that's also why psychoanalytic thinkers like Carl Jung place such a great deal of emphasis on things like individuation, which has to do with confronting our shadows and demons with an eye toward eventually living out a larger, healthier integration of our souls. It's because Jung was himself wise enough to realize that our enlightenment and our endarkenment are fundamentally interwoven, and that we don't get one without the other. So while the first reason why we find darkness so alluring has to do with the value of recognizing the fuller nature of our humanity, the second has to do with our attraction to wisdom, which only accrues when we acknowledge and accept the larger totality of what we are. However, a third reason has to do with our freedom and our desire to liberate our souls, and it circulates around one of the great paradoxes of human existence, that we're enslaved most thoroughly by what we're trying hardest to repress and ignore. Basically, the paradox is that what we're running from ends up running our lives. And the same is naturally true of anything we describe in terms of darkness. The more we run from it and resist it, the more it exerts its baleful influence and power over us. Basically, the way to liberate ourselves from being ruled by our darkness isn't to keep avoiding it or to pretend like it's not there, but to confront it honestly and to become intimately aware of its integral place in our lives. But that's not likely to happen as long as we're desperately trying to repress it out of fear. In fact, as long as we're paralyzed by our fear of it, our darkness will continue to rule and enslave us, both at the level of our individual lives as well as at the more general social level. In that regard, the darkness we fear and find so repulsive is actually nothing more than a possible portal to a better life. That is, if we can allow ourselves to recognize it, to become intimately familiar with its contours and subtleties, and in the process liberate ourselves from our habitual unwitting enslavement to it. And so I'd say that the third reason why we're so attracted to darkness is precisely a function of our fear of it. Basically, what we're really looking for is a liberation of our souls from our paralyzing fear of darkness, and consequently our paradoxical enslavement to it. However, in a way, all of that only begs a fairly obvious question. How can we start to do that in our actual lives? Well, I suspect that there are many possible answers to that question. Since I mentioned psychoanalytic thinkers earlier in this video, it's probably also good to mention psychotherapy, which in its better moments can definitely help with that process. But of course, psychotherapy isn't everyone's cup of tea. So, how else? Well, I think that creative experience can also help us become more self-aware, both in a general sense as well as with respect to the darker latitudes of our existence. And for some people, that may well be the preferable path. However, in my own personal experience, meditation has been invaluable in that regard. In essence, meditation, at least of the sort that I've been practicing for quite a few years now, is about learning to empty ourselves of our usual preoccupations, our thoughts, our worries, distractions, etc., and then to inhabit the present moment much more fully than we typically do. And one of the effects of learning to do that, of learning to unclutter our minds, so to speak, is that we can then have room to become aware of many things we normally keep hidden from ourselves. And our darkness is naturally part of all of that. Of course, what that means is that practicing meditation, or cultivating self-awareness in any form, actually requires courage, and a fair amount of it. In reality, it takes quite a bit of courage to sit in stillness, sometimes for hours, with only our breath for company. At the same time, it takes an abiding intrepidity to resist all the dubious enticements of a culture that centers itself around distraction and immediate gratification. But on the other hand, when you think about it, what more powerful adventure is there for human souls? What more noble task is there than to lay claim to the fuller arc of our humanity, to move toward real wisdom, and to liberate our souls along the way, despite all of the good convincing reasons we have not to do anything even remotely like that. And if encountering our darkness is the necessary price for all of that, well, maybe at the end of the day, it's a real bargain. Just a thought. Anyhow, thanks as always for watching, and as always, take care of your soul.